We're going to talk about our biggest
start.
fears today?
No.
That's not what we're doing today?
That's not what I was going to do today.
Oh,
We can do that. Biggest fear. 3, 2, 1, go.
You're ready?
No, what is it? Tell me right now. What's your biggest fear?
Eyeballs.
Eyeballs?
They are disgusting. I don't understand how they exist. They feel like they could puncture. They're in my body, but I can't see them. You have your own. People touch their own eyeballs. They're like liquidy. No. Eyeballs are
visceral.
Disgusting, and they're very scary.
But you're more afraid of eyeballs than like being burned alive.
Well, I don't spend as much time thinking about being burned alive, Justin, but I have had to deal with having to put eye drops in my own eye.
But you said biggest fear. What's the biggest one?
Death, Justin.
Yeah, but it's definitely death for you.
What
for me, it would be like being conscious while being like burned alive or liquefied. Like being present to that experience.
I think your brain would shut off.
Well, the biggest fear is it doesn't shut off.
That it doesn't, yeah. Have you ever seen like the YouTube videos where people will like go like deep cave spelunking and like they're crawling through like these super tight crevices.
You can't get out. Everything is dark.
And they use those plastic slides so that like it reduces friction so they can get into like super tight places. That for me is like, because like it's a nightmare of I can't move. Like that freaks me the fuck out. But I'm a big dude. It is easy for me to get stuck in places like claustrophobia and shit. Like I'm not petite. But just the thought of being wedged between the earth and having like a mountain above you and like the lights going out to where like you can't see anymore. You don't know what is around you.
Justin
you
looks unwell. Guys, what a pleasant Friday chat. Welcome to No Clear Answers, where we explore the common challenges all humans, creators, and leaders face and break down preconceived notions of common self-help ideas. We are your hosts. I'm Ricky Goldenberg.
I'm Justin Mulvaney.
And I'm Dr. Corey Wilkes.
Welcome, listeners, to another episode. Before we dive in, I just want to say thanks for listening. We appreciate you all. And we'd appreciate it if you subscribed on YouTube, followed the pod on your favorite platform, gave us a 5-star rating. Once again, Ricky is a cruel leader of this podcast who punishes us for any ratings below 5 stars. And this is actually real. Recommended the show to a friend. Stats show that's one of the most common ways people find podcasts. So if you appreciate the pod and you know somebody who you think would benefit from some of our episodes, we'd appreciate it if you recommended it.
That's such a nice plug, Justin. That was such a nice plug to remind people, because sometimes you forget, right? You're like, there's one podcast I've listened to for like 6 years, and they say it all the time, and I forget, and you just remind me, I gotta go give them a 5-star rating. I love that podcast.
Yes. Give them the 5-star rating.
Makes a huge difference.
Makes you a good person. Huge difference for them.
I'm always looking for ways to be a good person.
Be a good person. Give us 5 stars.
Get your 4 stars out of here, though, because if you give us 4 stars, I'm going to have to yell at them for weeks.
I'm pulling out my, Robert Cialdini influence, giving people social validation for it. Anyway, let's move on. Today's episode, the topics of today's episode, fear. Fear and what to do with it. Now, we're not going to solve fear today, to be really clear. This is such a big topic. There's so many different ways to think about it, so much behind it. So the goal with this episode is not to solve fear, but it's to actually slow down and give some earnest thought to the topic of fear. What is fear really? Where does it come from? What does it actually mean? How do we relate to fear in ways that can be not in service of us, that can get us stuck. And from there, how might we reconstruct our relationship with fear and work with fear when it shows up in a way that's actually in service of us? So again, we're not going to solve it or save the world here, but we really want to have like a meaningful exploration. So hopefully you all are walking away with some new ways to think about and work with fear when it shows up for you. And so, Corey and Ricky, I want to kick off with what feels like a really big and wide question, but I think we need to start here, which is, what is fear? What is fear? Where does it come from? What does it mean when it shows up? How do you think about this?
Corey, I need you to go first.
So fear to me, one, I think everybody has experienced fear because fear is hardwired into our brains and our DNA, right? From an evolutionary standpoint, fear is highly adaptive, right? If you experience fear, then you are driven to avoid the thing that is the source of fear. Typically, and we'll get more into this later, but typically fear is a response to danger. It is a signal of danger. So I struggle to define fear based on the experience because I think it is so universal. It's almost hard to put into words sometimes. But when I think about like, oh, I'm afraid of that thing, I think we usually mean I anticipate danger related to this decision, this path, this thing. And because I anticipate danger, I reflexively recoil from it. I reflexively go to avoid it. That is a working definition for fear for me.
Ricky, what is fear to you?
I think similar to Corey, fear at its root is a protective measure. In many ways, it's right. It's like when you experience something and then because of that, you've now have a learned behavior or learned response in order to protect yourself. So if we go back to like ingrained within our DNA, within our deep self, right? You're fearful of falling, right? Because you know that you could hurt yourself if you fall. Same with you're fearful of a large animal that you feel like could kill you. And so oftentimes I think of fear as at its root, it is the response to something that is dangerous. Now, that's at its root. But I think when we talk about fear today, the way that I actually think about fear and how it shows up is less about the trigger and more about the response. So a lot of times when we talk about fear, I think we're actually often talking more about our fight, flight, freeze response to a fear and how it is supporting or not supporting us, right? It's, to me, when I think about fear, especially in this day and age, it's usually around how it shows up in our bodies, how we feel panicked. And it's basically like a lot of times fear to me is really ingrained with the physical response to something that is a trigger that may or may not be something that's actually going to harm us. Like, for example, when you know that you're going to have to do a public speaking engagement, right? It's one of the number one fears of humans is having to speak in public. You're not going to die. No one's going to hurt you. And technically you are safe. Now, it might create widespread embarrassment, Justin, as like a topic we were talking about before this in terms of Black Mirror season 1, episode 1. But ultimately, when we talk about fear, a lot of it, I think, has to do with our physical response that might be actually out of alignment with the size of the trigger that is impacting us. That's how I think about fear. Because a lot of times fears is around, oh, I'm really scared of XYZ. And the thing itself isn't actually scary. It's all of the ways that we're responding to it is what's really eating up our brain and our energy and our exhaustion. That's not a definition, but that is my answer.
Yeah. Yeah, I like Ricky and Corey listening to you clicked some nuance into place that I'm going to use to paint an even more vibrant picture with my answer, which is fear for me at the very, very simplest core is an emotion, which means it is a set of physical sensations in your body. That is what fear is at its purest. And the physical sensations tend to be an invitation to, hey, pay attention to this. Right. And so like primal fear, if we think of an animal moving through the jungle and then they feel some fear that's telling them, hey, pay attention, there might be something in that bush over there. It's a set of sensations that are attempting to direct our attention in a certain way. And then, like you said, Ricky, I think what a lot of people say, they actually are meaning how they relate to their fear, how they have automatic responses tied into how they react when that series of physical sensations show up. There's another line I want to draw that I think is really important to inform the conversation, which I think of this as almost primal or natural fear versus egoic fear. And this is what I think makes the conversation around fear so nuanced, especially for human beings who have psyches and consciousnesses. Which
Can you define egoic, though?
Yeah, that's exactly where I'm going.
Thank goodness. Just making sure it's a word I don't know.
Primal or natural for me is, it's literally like watch an animal, watch like your cat, your dog, if you have pets, watch how they react to fear, which is, it's really clean. It's really just like there's a stimulus in the environment, in my external environment that's coming in, that's triggering some fear, that's making me go pay attention. The unique thing about us as humans is we have these imaginative faculties. We can craft stories about people and the world. And there's a different type of fear that shows up for me, which is when I trigger fear inside of myself because I'm imagining a possibility, worrying, or believing something about the world, right? And that fear for me has a very different signature. It's not that clean external stimulus inviting me to pay attention. It's actually, I'm imagining something that's putting me into a state of threat and fear. And I think we have to hold these two things differently, even though there's a similar sensation that happens in the body and similar reactions that happen. I actually think the pathway to working with those two states of fear is very different. I want to hold that going forward in the conversation.
I think it's a great note. And I also adds a lot of clarity, because I think that maybe it's because a lot of the work that we probably all experience and the work that we do, we're hanging out more on that imagined fear, right? That's something that it's very active. It takes up a lot of the brain space of the folks that we work with, and probably ourselves as well. Whereas the primal natural responses to fear are moments of true and real danger, real true danger. That's not, oh, I have to send that difficult email. And so they have different approaches, they have different responses, and they look really different from each other. Yeah. Really interesting dichotomy there that I had not thought about.
Isn't it a Seneca quote? We suffer more in imagination than in reality.
I just think that's fine. Yeah, definitely is the quote. Definitely is a quote. Someone will correct us.
Well, it's just, but it's that idea, right? Like very rarely are we either in actual danger or even in danger to the extent we believe we are, right? And well, I can get into this later, but basically the majority of the times when we are struggling with fear, with anxiety, the majority of it is just in our heads and not in any way based in our actual environment or reality.
Mm-hmm. That's true.
And that's what I'm pointing to here. And I think we have to work with these. Well, sometimes people in emotion language will use clean versus dirty, which is another one. Like there's a real clean experience of fear, which is it's just a clean fear, something external stimulus triggering fear that I want to look into, versus dirty fear, which is I'm in all these stories and building up a case that's putting me in a state of fear and threat. So fear it's a really ubiquitous experience. Something we all have every day, honestly. And so where do you all see people and yourselves get stuck with fear? How do you see people relating to fear in a way that's not in service of them?
My first question is, when is fear in service of them? When do you believe that fear is in service to us? Because the question is when it isn't. So
I watched Justin's face go like...
Well, I have an answer. I just don't know if that's the most useful direction, but we can go there. I would hold that fear can be very useful to us. Again, in that example where fear is pointing to, hey, there's something here for you to pay attention to that's important to you. I would almost argue most of the time that first order experience of fear, it's not good or bad. It just is. And then it's, as Ricky said, what we do with it when it shows up that informs, are we using this in a way that's in service of us, or are we using this in a way that's not in service of us? Well, that might be a way that you and I hold it differently. I don't hold fear as a bad thing.
It's more so, I think it's important to clarify, like, look, fear isn't always bad, right? Like the whole purpose of this episode is to just explore fear and how it shows up, right? But I think it is really easy for people to conceptualize fear as always bad, because we typically, the only time we're looking at fear or we're looking at how to overcome fear is because it has gotten in our way. But I think it's important to recognize that sometimes fear is very adaptive. Either it is adaptive outright because it helps you avoid something, or it is adaptive in that it is a signal of something you need to be paying attention to. Okay. So
I would actually,
I just wanted to say that first.
I would hold what Ricky says, which I don't think fear in itself, if we talk about that pure experience, is adaptive or maladaptive. It just is an experience. It's that then it's what we do as with the fear as a result of the fear being here that's adaptive or maladaptive.
Yeah, and I think that, Corey, what you were starting to point towards is that, I'll use a slightly different language, is sometimes fear is productive, right? If I'm about to get hit by a car and fear jumps up and pulls me out of the way, and then also teaches me that next time that I'm at that crosswalk, I should look both left and right before I cross. That's fear in use, right? I'm learning from an experience. I'm putting protective measures in place, and it's a small change. Now, where it gets more complicated and where it gets more dangerous is when the fear response is either really strong, seems out of context with the trigger, or has an extended period of time and impacts us from taking action or protecting or supporting ourselves, right? Like that could look like, I'm so scared of public speaking that it stops me from doing things that I need to do, right? It's impacting my executive functioning levels. It's impacting my ability to like call and order a pizza, and we aren't able to work within it. So yeah, I don't think that like fear most of the time is trying to protect us, and or it's trying to inform us, like Justin was saying, like, oh, there's something here that you have to pay attention to, right? So if I know public speaking is really scary for me, there's a difference between deciding, well, then I'm never going to speak in public again, and or deciding, okay, so I might be more cautious about which public speaking engagements I take on. And when I do speak in public, I also might look for support in that space. Might get my hands on some beta blockers. I'm just kidding. But it's like thinking through what do we do with the information that fear is feeding to us?
Yeah. So to your question, Justin, with, basically when is fear not adaptive? When is it not productive? Like when does it kind of get in our way, right? Like when is it not helpful? The biggest thing that I see with people is when they basically say fear means danger, right? So they're like, well, fear is smoke, which means there's fire near. And in modern society, very rarely are we in actual danger. Overall, some people, some locations, whatever, but overall, most of the time you're not in danger. Okay. The issue is your brain can still respond to things as if you are in danger. So like from a physiological standpoint, you can respond to a bear being in your vicinity to this, the level of fear response you have to seeing a bear can equal the same fear response you have when you have a job interview, or when you have to have a quote unquote hard conversation with somebody, or when you publish a piece of content, or when you do whatever. Clearly, you're not in danger when you go to a job interview. And if you are, probably not a job interview to do, right? But if you assume, well, when I experience fear, that means I'm in danger. That gets a lot of people in trouble, because you can be afraid but not be in danger, just like you can be in danger but not feel fear, right? So an example I used to give all the time when I taught intro psych was, if I put a gun to your head, do you experience fear? And most people would say, yes, my life is threatened. And it's like, okay, so you have all this fear, but it's actually a Nerf gun. But if you don't know it is a Nerf gun, right, because you're not in danger, it isn't a real gun. But because you don't know that, you have concocted this whole scenario in your mind. And then now you're flooded with fear. But the opposite can also be true. You could have been walking to your car and I could have had a fucking sniper rifle on you. You're in hella danger, but you didn't fucking know it. So you experienced no fear, even though you are definitely in the presence of danger, right? So a simple question that you can ask is, okay, I'm experiencing fear, but am I in danger? Is this representative of danger? Most of the time it isn't. And as soon as you recognize that, you can be like, okay, so this fear is uncomfortable, but maybe it's a signal for something else. I can push past this fear if the thing on the other side of fear is important enough to learn to push past it. Right? Because what is that? It's like a Franklin Roosevelt FDR quote. He says, courage is not the absence of fear, but rather the assessment that something else is more important than fear. Right. And I think about that a lot, of like, I can totally recognize that fear is here, but there's usually something more important on the other side of that. So how do I prevent fear from stopping me from moving forward? Because most of the time I'm not in danger.
The places where I most commonly, or the ways I most commonly see people get stuck, I'm thinking in terms of almost like behavioral patterns or ways of relating to fear. The most common is most definitely, there's fear here, therefore go away from it. I'm not going to approach the thing that's making me feel fear. That's the most common. And that one is, I think for a lot of people, it can be devastating to progress into moving towards things that people want. Right? Like I think of my work with founders and leaders, and it's like, usually the most important decisions and the biggest needle movers for you in your life are going to bring up fear. And if every time fear shows up, you interpret that as, I can't go toward this, I can't do it, instead of being able to slow down and hold the fear. And Corey, you said something that I think is really important, which is decide if you're willing to actually take the risk, willing to bear with the discomfort of the fear, understand the risk that the fear is pointing to, because I don't think the fear is ever not pointing to a risk, but identify the risk that the fear is pointing to and decide if you're willing to take that risk. If you're always just bouncing away from fear when it shows up, you're stuck. You're totally stuck. I think the next two, which are more secondary for me, but I see them equally as much causing problems. There is a kind of modern way of relating to fear, which is, a lot of this fear is psychological. It shows up when when you're not actually in the absence of danger. So override it. Screw your fear. Just go. Just do it anyway. That can work, but I don't like that as a heuristic, because sometimes that fear is actually really pointing to something important. And so I don't like the muscle equally as much that's just override it. Just run over your fear. And the third way I see people really getting stuck is fixating on fear, which is, Corey, again, I think this is linked to what you're saying, which is, I need to make my fear go away. Where's this fear coming from, and how can I make the fear go away? And once I get the fear to go all the way away, then I can move forward, as opposed to getting the information that the fear is holding, but still being able to take action while being in the experience of being afraid. And any and all of these things are ways that I see people get so stuck with fear, including myself.
It's so interesting, because as you were both speaking, the thing that really kept resonating with me is that, and Justin, you're talking about it, avoid it, silence it, get rid of it, and where it's information. And for me, there's this really interesting thing about playing with the idea that fear is a guide. Fear is in the hero's journey, yeah, it's the mentor, it's the wise old thing that says, this thing is hard. Let's still move towards it. I'm going to challenge you. I'm going to make you uncomfortable. And at some point, after you've gone through these challenges in hero's journey, the mentor usually has to die so that they can actually move forward. Yeah, you might have to move past the fear that has been guiding you along. But ultimately, it's part of the challenge. It's part of the growth. It's part of moving through difficult experiences. And so shying away from it, I see it. It's really, it's a transformational hero's journey process when you think about fear. It's basically recognizing how difficult something is going to be, spending time with it, engaging with it. And then over time, it's not that you necessarily kill it. It's actually that you don't need it anymore. You don't need the wise old guide of fear because now you have sort of ingrained it. You've battled with it. You've moved on.
Yeah, I think the root of a lot of our troubles with fear is an incapability to just be with and hold the experience of fear.
Yeah, I'm keeping it as my weird, wise old mentor man vibe fear guide. That's what I'm doing. That's mine for now. That resonates with me. That's my metaphor. It's hanging out with me. It's coming with me on a journey.
So how do we reconstruct our relationship to fear then? These are the ways that we get stuck.
Just make fear Gandalf. I'm just kidding. We can give a much more nuanced answer to this.
I really think learning to learn from fear, right? So like, I would not say that I'm immune to fear by far, but outside of things that like put me in danger, like I'm never going to fucking skydive or some shit. Like I am absolutely fucking terrified and I will never do it because I see nothing productive about doing it. Some people may, because, oh, you're doing it. That means you can do hard shit. I do hard shit on a daily basis. I don't need to jump out of a fucking plane. But I think learning to acknowledge fear and not even necessarily accept it so much as just acknowledge that it is there, because I definitely skew more toward like a stoic approach to things. Whether or not that means I'm emotionally stunted, I accept that. I don't give a fuck. But I think acknowledging fear and then saying, okay, what has fear come here to teach me or to help me learn? And then taking that lesson and then moving forward on your terms, based on your values, your goals, the things you want to do in life. That has been the approach that I have found super beneficial. And I've helped other people do similar things. So then you're not denying it. You're not blindly accepting it, and you're not letting it stop you. You're saying it's here. Yes, there's some lesson in here that is my responsibility to learn because I get to choose what I learned from this experience. And then now I take that new learning, that new insight with me into the future on my terms specifically. So that way fear isn't holding me back, but I'm not living in denial, all those other things. That is how I think about it first. Go ahead.
I love it because it's like you're describing almost a dialogue. It's a conversation. It's not, it's recognizing that fear is showing up in a moment and it's saying, hey, hold on. We should talk about this. And it doesn't mean we ignore it. We don't say, hey, shut up, you. We say, oh, okay, like I think there's something here to learn about. Let's figure this out. Let's figure out how this can be useful to me, how it can be supportive, and move through it. I think fear really can be a dialogue. Not when we're watching like jump out scary horror movies. That's different. That's not what we're talking about here.
But I think that there's a very tangential conversation around like, well, what if I'm an anxious person, right? Then I live in fear to some degree throughout the day, right? And I'm not even talking about like clinical anxiety, just, I am an anxious person, which that could be a whole separate episode about, labeling and attaching your identity to a thing. I am an anxious person. It's a whole different set of issues that can cause. But let's say you are an anxious person and your day to day, you're just kind of swimming in low key fear, right? Well, then Ricky is like, well, then what the fuck does that have to teach me? Well, look at specifically, what are the triggers of your fear? You may have like a background, like static, like a white noise anxiety that may potentially be your baseline, in which case I would probably recommend you figure that shit out through meditation or some other kind of thing. But there are still specific triggers that will exacerbate that fear, that anxiety response, right? So then it's like psychologists would call it metacognition, which is thinking about thinking, learning to observe your actual thoughts, right? So then when a certain thing happened, your thoughts went in a different direction, and then your anxiety, increased. Well, what were the specific thoughts that swirled in your head? It was like, well, I thought about doing this thing, and then I immediately thought, well, what would my mom say? How would my friends respond? What about this? What if it fails? What about all these other things? And then because maybe you're prone to a certain level of anxiety and fear response and heightened fear response. Well, the fact that you had those thoughts piqued that fear. So then learning to say, okay, these are the specific thoughts that when I have them, my fear response goes through the roof. How can I learn from these, learn to be more aware of the things that can potentially trigger these thoughts, learn to understand the actual thoughts and potentially where they came from, but also what would be more productive thoughts that I can start to practice that will be more empowering for me down the future, right? Because I'm a huge fan of whatever you consistently do, you get better at, for better or worse, right? Some people are Olympic level worriers because they spent 30 years plus worrying. And then they try to meditate for 5 minutes and they're like, well, meditation doesn't fucking work for me. You're comparing 30 years of worrying to 5 fucking minutes of sitting still, right? Of course you suck at that. But I think if you see this as a skill of metacognition, of I can learn to observe these thoughts and I can learn to rewrite this narrative of the things that I tell myself, that can go a long way too. Because I know that will be a rebuttal from people. Is like, well, I'm an anxious person, Corey. What the fuck can fear teach me if I'm afraid all day, every day to some degree? Go ahead.
I was like getting really excited as you were talking, because what it was also reminding me of is that, this isn't okay, so now I'm going to go straight into metacognition and I'm going to start having this conversation with fear and I'm going to be able to handle it, because we just don't do that. And something that was really resonating with me, well, besides the fact, like, if you spend 30 years being an Olympic warrior, 5 minutes of meditation ain't gonna fix it. Like, it ain't. But the thing that was actually coming up for me was that I probably talked about the book before. There's a book called Burnout. It's by the Nagoski sisters. I think it's Amelia and Emily Nagoski. And one of the components that they talk about in that book is like built up stress that's within our bodies, which are basically incomplete stress cycles, which are when we get triggered, right, by like an email and we go into freeze, fight response, and there's no release. And so if we've been living our life in a period of time of heightened response to triggers, right, we constantly are acting and putting our brain in a space of, I'm being chased by a cheetah. Because if we focus on primal natural fear, right, I get chased by a cheetah, I finally make it home, the cheetah is gone, I am safe, there's a release there of the stress. But for most of us, because we're responding instead to, I guess, egoic, these sort of like story fears instead, there's no release. So I get that scary email, it throws me into freeze, fight, whatever response. I respond to the email and I send it off, or I finish the presentation. I don't get that same release because it's not a real physical primal fear that has impacted me. And so another thing that I think is really interesting is that trying to have that dialogue when you also already have built up stress, anxiety, fear response in the body, you might need some time to work through some of those things first as well. We can't jump into metacognition if your response to everything is being built up. And so if that resonates with you, I would say definitely read that book. That book has like 7 different science-backed systems in releasing stress and closing stress cycles. Like, one of them is obviously meditation, but ultimately recognizing that closing stress cycles can help also reduce like the built up fear that you might have been creating in your body that's going to impact your ability. Similar to the 30 years of a professional warrior, you need to also figure out how to start to release some of the worry as well.
I think something that's a through line in all of this is that the first step in having a conscious relationship with fear requires some body intelligence, which is one, an awareness of, okay, I'm afraid. There's some fear here. I'm feeling fear. And then secondarily, the capacity to allow for that experience to be here without needing to immediately do something about it. Right? All of this process, this ability to, if it's this more egoic story triggered fear, I'm self-triggering fear, it requires a capacity to recognize that and then slow way down and be in the experience of fear to inspect it and to work with it. And so the first step for me, no matter what, is, can I acknowledge when there is fear here and allow for that experience? Because the game I like to play is, no matter what for me, whether or not it's egoic or that more primal fear, the fear is here to teach me something. It's trying to get me to pay attention to something. Now, if I'm in egoic fear, if I'm in a state of threat, it's inviting me to pay attention to, hey, there are these thoughts and belief structures that I'm holding that are sending me into fear, even when there's not immediately danger to be here. And so it's an invitation there to, hey, pay attention to what are the thoughts, what are the things that I'm thinking of, and go find them, and would I be willing to challenge them? Like Corey, you pointed to something, a frequent experience is approval, right? I'm triggering myself with a thought of a loss of approval with somebody that also usually ties to my sense of security, because I have a belief that I need some set of people's approval for security. And the first step for that kind of belief-based threat is to slow down. I'm afraid. It's okay to be afraid. And now, what am I believing that's causing me to be afraid? And would I be willing to challenge that thought? Would I be willing to play around with that thought and see the opposite? But all of it requires a rewiring of the relationship to fear, which is, it's okay that it's here. And like you said, Ricky, it's a guiding voice that's inviting me to pay attention to something. It's inviting me to face something, to learn something, to pay attention. For me, clean fear then is more of what it's usually pointing to. Is I always use analogies of like learning to ride a bike or being out on surfing. Usually it's just a gift of, hey, just put your attention over here, right? Just, there's something over here that might need to get paid attention to. Like, even for me, that doesn't always have to be tied to danger. Like, I see sometimes founders will be navigating their company and just get a little bit of fear out of how some section of their company is going. And that, if I don't work myself up to some catastrophic, oh, my company might fail, it can actually just be, oh, my fear is telling me there might be a mess over there that I want to pay attention to. Let me just go find it and go put my attention over there. And so for me, like with egoic fear, I'm realizing now the invitation is pay attention inward. What are the things in here that I'm scaring myself with? Whereas with that more clean experience of fear, it's, oh, what out there wants my attention? And can I go and give my attention to that? So we've talked about what fear is. We've talked about how we can relate to fear in ways that aren't in service. We've talked about rebuilding a relationship to fear. What are the actionable, practical, what are offerings that we have for people who are listening? And this can be around what we've discussed. It can be other things, but what offerings do we have for folks around working with fear? What the hell to do with their fear when it shows up?
So a couple things. I'll do two super practical ones and then a third, a little more abstract, but super helpful. So when you say fear, you are specifically talking about the physiological aspects of fear and anxiety, right? A lot of people conflate the two. And you're just like, I need to calm down because I am so up in my feels. I know my judgment is clouded, right? Because that's really what a lot of fear does, is it shifts your perspective and causes you to be myopic, to be short-sighted. If this is the only thing I can see right now is the problem, I cannot see a solution because I'm too close to what's going on right now, because I'm so emotionally aroused with fear. If that is the case, there are a couple like quote unquote psychology hacks you can do beyond all the typical shit like meditate and everything else, which I always am a huge proponent of. But
I didn't realize, Corey, that you were such a fan of hacks.
Right, we did a whole
I
episode.
thought you called bullshit on hacks. Corey, you got hacks?
I'll rephrase it. A psychological shortcut that few people know about. How about that?
Not a hack, shortcut.
Shortcut.
Not a hack,
totally
it's a
different.
shortcut.
Totally different. Totally different.
Colloquially referred to as a hack. Yes.
Yeah, Corey would never be a fan of hacks, but occasionally he'll take a shortcut.
So when I was in grad school, and again, back when I was trained to do therapy, one of the things we learned for anxiety and like low-key panic attacks and things was like, if somebody is like really struggling to calm down because they're so just heightened, tell them to run up and down stairs a couple times, assuming you're able, all that other shit, talk to your doctor, whatever. But if you run up and down stairs, you calm down. And the reason for this is some psychobabble shit. It's rooted in basically, it's called the Schachter-Singer two-factor theory of emotion. All it really means is a lot of times we will have a physiological response to something in our environment, and then we will label it as basically good or bad. And the way we label it dictates our actual emotional response to it. So the fact that you had heart racing, sweaty palms, all this other shit, and then you ran up and down stairs, you now label, oh, the reason I'm experiencing these physiological symptoms is because I ran up and down stairs. Well, because you labeled it that way, there's no fear response anymore because your brain isn't attributing it to fear, right? It's also why it's called the misattribution of arousal. It's also why like going to scary movies is a popular date thing, because the idea is, the hypothesis is, when you and I are at a scary movie and you watch the scary movie and it makes you jump, well, what does that do? Physiologically, it makes your heart race, makes you get a little sweaty, makes you, whatever. Well, then you hold me and you're like, oh, I feel this way because of this fucking hunk of a man. Ricky about choked on water. So you now attribute these sensations to me, and then now you're all hot and bothered because again, I'm a hunk of burning love.
This hunk of a man.
But that's one of the reasons why scary movies are such a popular date thing, because of this misattribution of arousal. Okay. So that's one. Run up and down stairs, do something active like that, and that can very quickly calm you down. If you're struggling with meditation, deep breathing, all those other things that are super effective, that is another like weird thing a lot of people don't really know a lot about. Going for a walk is one of the most underrated things you can do. And again, I can throw psychobabble terms on it and call it bilateral stimulation. It's a whole school of thought. All that literally means is stimulating both parts of your fucking body. Like you can go into some esoteric types of interventions that claim this, and all it really means is just move both sides of your body, which walking does. That is why you think better either on a long walk or after a long walk. Okay. Because both, you've given yourself mental space from the thing stressing you out, the stressor, the environment, but you've also stimulated your brain in a way through that bilateral stimulation that you ordinarily may not have been doing, that then gives you a different level of clarity. So if you are really struggling with fear, or you are at a fork in the road and need to make a really important decision, but fear and anxiety are clouding your judgment, a stupid simple thing you can do literally is just take a long fucking walk and see what clarity you have either throughout that walk or at the end. Super simple things. Step above.
Corey,
go ahead.
I want to keep riding just briefly. So some other things I've had people play with and seen work. To Ricky's point before, which is sometimes what happens is we have a response, a fight, flight, freeze response that wants to mobilize and we don't mobilize. I've actually been in spaces where, similar to what you're saying, Corey, is if there's a fight response that's coming up in your body, or that running upstairs is like mobilize the response. If you're in a space where you can go and mobilize the response, if you want to fight, if you want to flight, I've had people before who they've said they've come out of a meeting and they felt a flight response, and I'll be like, go mobilize the response, go for a walk, give yourself your body the feeling of moving that response so it can re-ground itself. Or freeze or hide. I've been in spaces where it's like literally go hide under a blanket somewhere, right? Give yourself that experience just so your body gets to complete that response. And then again, can hold the experience and the fear more rationally. If it's not quite that intense, the modern research on emotion shows if we actually are with the sensations and feel them, they tend to be a 60 to 90 second experience. We talked about this in emotional intelligence. So if it's not quite that intense, another thing is, put your conscious attention on the fear that's in your body, I'll also tell people, also ground yourself, like notice the sensation of your feet on the floor and just give yourself some deep conscious breaths. And sometimes if it's accessible to you, people will have the experience of the fear cresting, right? It grows and like, oh, it's getting bigger. And just like a wave, after 45 seconds, it kind of crests and the actual experience of it comes down. And there might be some shaking. There might be some other things your body wants to do in that. But these are ways of moving the actual physiological experience of fear through your body. So then all these other techniques of being with fear as a guide and getting the information from fear comes after allowing for that experience to be moved through.
Agreed. The third thing that is again, because the first two were like more anxiety related, rooted in fear, but just fear overall. A big thing that I talk a lot about is what I call the 4 horsemen of fear. And these are the 4 most common limiting beliefs that tend to hold people back. And they are the fear of failure, which everybody's super familiar with. Like, what if this doesn't work out? What if I'm not good enough? What if nobody buys? The fear of uncertainty, which is what if I make the wrong decision, right? Like I'm at a fork in the road and I don't know which direction to go. And I'm so afraid of making the wrong decision, I end up making no decision. This is where people get, the whole analysis paralysis. You try to over research, you try to pre-optimize, find out all the answers and create the perfect plan before you start. Then there is fear of ridicule, right? Which is, well, what will other people think or say? How might they respond? So then you get so caught up in how other people might respond, you just kind of shrink back and just kind of play it safe. And the fourth one is fear of success. And a lot of times you're like, well, Corey, why would I be afraid to achieve the thing I claim to want? And for a lot of people, success represents crossing a threshold and becoming a different version of yourself. Again, we reflexively, we fear what we don't understand. Again, that is largely adaptive from an evolutionary perspective. Well, because you don't understand this new version of yourself, you reflexively kind of self-sabotage and recoil away from achieving that success to become that person. Other times people just believe that they don't deserve success, right? Or it'll change them for the negative. I'll lose my ambition. It'll mean I've peaked in life. I'll become corrupted by power and influence, all these other things. Again, there's no danger in any of these necessarily, but there's a lot of fear around it, which then causes people to, again, engage in self-sabotaging behaviors. So when people are struggling with these fears or many others, what happens is you start to catastrophize, right? What if this happens? What if I fail? What if people make fun of me? What if I make the wrong decision? And the issue is you treat this catastrophizing as a rhetorical question, right? You don't actually answer the question. You just say, well, what if I fail? And then you just spin around and you never answer it. Instead, you can do what I call fear inoculation, right? So I'm not that kind of doctor, but my understanding of how vaccines and inoculations work, you introduce a little bit of the bad thing in a controlled environment so that you can build up a tolerance or an immunity in case you ever come across the real bad thing, right? Fear inoculation is basically just answering the rhetorical question you're already asking yourself all day, every day, right? Which basically says, well, what if I fail? Answer that fucking question. What if you do fail? Assume you fail. With that assumption in place, what will you do now? How can you learn from it? How can you recover from it? Whatever. Assume people make fun of you. Assume you succeed and lose your ambition. Okay, what can you do to regain your ambition, right? Or you made the wrong decision or whatever. Whatever these questions are, you're already asking yourself. The issue is you're not answering them. So if you stop treating them as a rhetorical and actually answer them through fear inoculation, you will then feel much more prepared to deal with it. Because fundamentally, we fear the unknown. So by making the unknown known, or at least knowable, we can rob fear of its power over us, right? That is, and again, that goes with any kind of fear, right? Even if you're afraid of death, people who have like strong religious or spiritual beliefs aren't afraid of death, right? Because they're like, oh, I quote unquote, I know what happens after I die. If you don't have those beliefs, you're like, fuck, what happens after I die? If you're afraid of the dark, you're not afraid of being alone in the dark. You're afraid of not being alone in the dark, right? It's, well, what else is here? What about this? What if this, right? Learning to make the unknown known is how you restructure your relationship with fear. Go ahead, Ricky.
No, I was just going to say, I think the thing that's also interesting here is that it's not necessarily, although I like the phrase making the unknown known, for me, as you're talking, it's not necessarily saying I can now know everything because I've experienced this fear inoculation. It's instead, I know that I can handle I know what I can handle, what I think might happen. And there's something really powerful in that, because oftentimes what we do instead is that we shy away, that we say, oh, like I'm scared of that thing, so I'm going to avoid that thing, so I'm not going to do this thing. And if we start to engage with fear of inoculation, which, great question is, what's the worst that could happen? Okay, so what would you do? What's the worst? What's the worst? What's the worst? What would you do? You start to realize, oh, I could handle it. The worst thing that could happen if this fear becomes known, right? Unknown. It's not necessarily that now that I know I'm more prepared. It's actually, I now believe that I myself can handle what might come my way, no matter how scary it is. And I think there's something really powerful there. Justin, do you want to share some things that you offer folks? Or you want me to go next?
I want to piggyback off of Corey because there's something I really want to ride here, which is I think so often when we can't be with fear and actually hold it as that guide, and like you said, Corey, actually identify what we're afraid of, we don't actually get to the real question. And when I'm working with people with fear, I want to get them to the actual question. And like if we hold fear as a guide, that whether or not it's egoic or natural, it's pointing us to things that we don't want to have happen. We're afraid of them happening. We don't want them to happen. Like the process for me with fear is be with the fear, allow for it to illuminate all the things that I'm afraid of that I don't want to have happen. 2, if it's egoic, challenge, is that story actually real, or am I just scaring myself with something? Like allow myself to challenge these fears, even if that's relevant. Again, this thing of approval, it's a really big one for me. Do I actually need these people's approval? Is this even actually something to be afraid of? From there, it's then, okay, cool, I've got all these things I don't want to have happen. The next question is, what can I do about them? Which is what Corey's saying, right? This is fear inoculation. Can I do anything about them in advance? And if they come to pass, what can I do about them afterwards? And then almost always for me, the fundamental question that we're left with is, based on what I'm afraid of, based on what could happen and what I can do about it, am I willing to take the risk? That for me is the real question. A lot of people are looking to totally avoid their fear or make the fear totally go away. And almost always in a complex, imperfect world, what we are left with is there is some risk here. And the real question is, am I willing to take the risk or not? And it's not a problem for me if we get to that point and we, from a place of fear, go, I'm not willing to take that risk right now. Great. But I want people to actually get there. I want us to get all the way of here's all of the risk, here's everything I can do with it, and hold that with fear as a guide of saying, am I willing to take that leap or not? That's the wisdom of fear is if we can be with it, it lets us face all of that and actually make a fully conscious decision. And over time, we can grow our relationship to fear and risk in that. Maybe we notice we always say no, and at some point it's like, God, no, now I really think I am ready. I'm sick and tired of this. I'm going to take the leap despite fear. But I want people to get all the way through it. Ricky, what you got?
I think if
Ricky, did you take a bunch of cough medicine before this episode?
Because can you tell how sick I am?
Yeah, you just are like looking off in a daze in the spaces.
Can you tell in my voice that I'm clearly sick? And then also I got woken up by a toddler this morning at 6 a.m. who showed up and said, my sleeps are all gone. And I was like, oh shit. Okay.
Yeah, you're definitely an octave lower. Yeah,
I know. I was like, we dropped down. We dropped down a level. Listen, it's hard. It's hard to be 9 months pregnant, which is what I am at this point, with a toddler who woke me up at 6 o'clock in the morning and I'm sick, and you can't take any cough medicine when you're pregnant.
Oh, that's right.
But I'm here, friends. Okay, so for me, it's because normally I'm very with it, guys. So for me, I think about it as one side of things is around how do you do when you're having an unnatural response to fear? Because that's one of the components that we've been talking about here too, is like when it's kind of like out of range with the thing that is occurring. So a couple things there. One, This one is from Dr. Brian King, who wrote a book called Taking It Easy. There's one thread that I pull out of that book that I always enjoyed, which is when you're having that moment that you feel fight, flight, freeze coming on, is say out loud, this is not a threat to me. Wildly effective. It's when you're like stuck in traffic and someone cuts you off and you start feeling yourself getting like angry, or someone is like coming too close to you and it's making you nervous. Or it's like basically when you feel yourself going into a response that feels out of alignment with the size of the trigger, this is not a threat to me. Just saying it starts to get funny too, which he's actually happens to be like also a comedian, but the whole book is kind of funny. But recognizing this is not a threat to me can help you eliminate that primal natural like response and recognize that it's actually a go. It's like a story that you're telling yourself that this is not actually your life is not in danger. You are okay. I love that one. Another one that I love is an interrupter when things are going on. And this is from Ethan Kroos, who wrote Chatter, which is using your name. So I still remember this was years ago. Our fire alarm went off at 4:00 in the morning. Super scary. Like all of the fire alarms going off at 4:00 in the morning. My daughter's waking up. We don't know. We're so not awake. We can't figure out, is there a fire? Is something wrong? The fire department's coming, right? It's like, it was a very scary experience because it's loud. It wakes you up from nothing. It was hard to sleep for the next few days. And one of the things from Ethan Kroos's book is this idea of using your name and kind of having a conversation with yourself, almost with the fear, but also with yourself. Because I would go to bed and I'd be like, is it going to happen again? Right? And my body was already primed for this really strong response to something that didn't exist. And so being able to say, hey, Rick, it's unlikely it's going to happen again. It was a fluke. The batteries needed to be replaced. It got triggered by something random. Like, also, what's the worst that could happen? The unknown known. You know what to do if it happens again. So it basically like helps you create a dialogue with yourself and the fear. The last one in terms of like dealing with these kind of out of space responses is the it's for anxiety. It's the like 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The one it's like 5 things you can see around you, 4 things you can touch. You basically go through the senses, which you could also just go through the senses, which is like, okay, what can I hear? What can I see? What can I taste? What can I smell? It could sort of help you come back into the present. But working on the bigger fears, like the ones that are legitimate and sort of might be egoic, might be primal that we're working through, for me, a lot of that is going to be around, it's a slower experience, right? Everything that I just offered here is around, okay, how do I navigate through this and interrupt it a little bit? But when you're dealing with a really big fear, like the ones that Corey was sharing, or Justin, how you were talking about this, I think it's important to know that like they all take a little bit longer. It takes a little bit of metacognition. It might take work with a therapist or a coach or self-reflection or journaling. It basically is going to force you to have a little bit more of a conversation with Gandalf, our fear guide, which is now who will always be referenced for me in my brain. But recognizing that that's a little bit of a different experience. That's actually navigating. These are real stories that I'm telling myself and fears that I need to navigate, and how do I work through it? So those are all of mine.
2 left banging around this head over here. One thing that I've really been clued into recently in myself and others is how, Corey, this goes to your kind of arousal theory, how tightly excitement and fear are coupled together. I'm pretty sure there's some research that actually shows they're coupled very tightly together in the nervous system.
Physiologically, they're basically the same.
Yeah. And so one game I really play, especially when people start feeling fear for things that are high stakes and important to them in their life, is, would you just try on excitement for a second? Would you actually try on, am I excited here? Because it's very easy to label the sensations as, oh, I'm afraid, and lock down on them. And trying on, am I excited? Is there excitement here? And letting yourself move some of that is really helpful. I had a coach really beautifully hold me in this the week before my wedding, getting married, very excited, but also nervous. And I felt myself kind of starting to like lock in on it because it just felt like a lot. And he was like, I want you to do something for me. I want you to just let yourself like jump up and down and clap and like yip and yell and see how it feels. And suddenly it was like just taking that energy and moving it. Suddenly there was just almost like overwhelming excitement here. And so sometimes I see people locking down and freezing and going, God, I'm so afraid, when really, if they just moved a little bit, suddenly they go, oh no, I'm actually just locking down on my excitement. So one thing I'm way on with people who are going up to high stakes moments is move your damn body, because you might just find, oh no, I'm just really excited. But when I lock down on it, suddenly I'm freezing around it. And now I think I'm afraid.
I love that.
It's such I've been doing this a lot with people in transition who have they have high stakes interviews that they're really excited for. And what I tell them to do is, I'm like, literally, they say I make myself really anxious starting like 10 minutes before the interview. And what I tell them is put on your favorite song and dance around.
Party.
Dance.
I give the exact same advice.
It's such a quick shift, because so often like we're excited and we scare ourselves.
Yeah. I use it for myself all the time. It's similar, Corey, to your like running up and down the stairs, right? It's like, you might be nervous, you might be excited, you might be fearful, but that release of that built up tension, I am such a fan of a 2-minute dance party.
Yeah.
I love that.
I also think we've talked about this, that goes into part of this whole thing, is being able to work with fear in your body, mobilizing it if you need to, grounding around it, lots of somatic techniques for coming back into it. I like the analogy, Ricky, you've hit on, which is fear as kind of this wise Gandalf who's saying, be cautious. Here are the things to be cautious. I also have found there's another character that's useful, of like fear being the really frightened, like a frightened kid, a really frightened one inside of you. And being able to not only dialogue with this Gandalf-esque wisdom, but this really tender fear that can come up. And the benefit of that for me is such that sometimes when fear gets really big, it can be hard to hold ourselves in a compassionate sense. And being able to have a signature of that element of fear, which is, oh, there's a really tender little part of me here that sometimes just get really afraid. And being able to meet yourself in that part of you in compassion, such that you can ground yourself and then start to move through and be with it, is also really important. So get familiar not only with Gandalf, but with the little kid that's with us always until the day that we die, that sometimes gets scared, and being able to hold and meet ourselves there.
I love that the thing that we didn't land on in this conversation was like, kill the fear, feel the fear, and do it anyway.
Just like, briefly, you can't. It will never go away.
That is the narrative that's like so often all around us on the internet. Feel the fear, do it anyway. Kill the fear. It's like very like as if I could battle it physically. And like, that's not the conversation we're having here, and that makes me very happy.
Like, listen, sometimes we will do things while afraid. I advocate for that, but I just don't think it's a realistic or wise strategy to go, fuck fear, let's just override it. Some people can do it, but it just doesn't feel, it's not realistic for most people. Some people are psychos that can just do that. And God, what a good strategy, until they do something that they should have legitimately been afraid of, and then they get eaten by a lion. Corey, you've got something. Yeah.
Well, so a couple thoughts, some more controversial than others. So largely, fear and anxiety are a luxury because they typically mean you have time to think. They typically mean you are not doing something actively in that moment, right? If you're being chased by a lion, you may be, physiologically like just super hyped up and things, but you're not really thinking the 15 different ways this lion could kill you, or this, like you are singularly focused, right? A lot of times, if you actually think about it, when you are experiencing anxiety, fear, for the purpose of this conversation, I'll use them synonymously right now. It's because you're sitting and just thinking. You're pontificating about the possibilities. You're not actually doing a thing, right? And I've heard this little quip about, action is the antidote to anxiety. To an extent, it is, or it can be. right? Think of a lot of the times when you have just, and you know, creators and entrepreneurs are really bad for this sometimes, especially early on. You sit around and you think and you think and think and think and you plan. And then you get to a certain point where you're like, fuck, this is so anxiety inducing, so fear inducing because it is overwhelming. But as soon as you start, or as soon as you start to do the thing, a lot of that goes away because you realize you had concocted this whole fucking story that wasn't based in reality and didn't come to fruition. Right. Or even like if you have to have like a hard, quote unquote, hard conversation with somebody, as soon as the conversation starts, typically it doesn't turn out nearly as bad as you would catastrophize. Right. So in that respect, yes, action can be an antidote to anxiety. And yes, anxiety and fear are a luxury because they mean you're not actually in survival mode most of the time. You're not in active danger most of the time. Okay. So it's a more controversial take. Another thing that I personally have experienced and really benefited from, specific around when you have to give a presentation or put yourself into some sort of, you know, arena in that respect. Because I think it's pretty common across the people that each of us works with, right? Whether they're, you know, executives or founders or creators, a lot of times you at some point have to give a larger presentation or just talk to a lot of people. And I think fear of public speaking is a huge issue a lot of people struggle with. Okay. I've talked a lot. I've had like legit training on public speaking. Now that you can fucking tell how much I cuss and my Southern drawl, but I just disregard a lot of it. Every single time. And I love the fucking sound of my voice. I love talking. I love talking to people. I can do it all day. Every single time before a podcast, before I do a presentation or workshop, whatever, my hands get sweaty and I have to pee. Every single time without fail. I was on Pat Flynn's podcast a while ago. And for people who don't know, like Pat is a big name in like the entrepreneur podcaster creator space. And Pat and I, we were talking about that, of how like we both have that same experience. And Pat has talked to huge audiences, got paid a bunch of money to go do a bunch of public speaking. He's like, every time, man, I've got to pee. That doesn't go away. But one of the things that he and I have both kind of separately come across, and a lot of other people have too, is I've realized fear is selfish a lot of the times. When I focus on myself and my own insecurities, that is when all this fear and anxiety comes up. What will other people think of me? You know, what if I mess up my words? What if I'm not dressed appropriately? Or what if I, you know, go over time or whatever? If instead you shift your perspective on the audience, the people you're delivering the message to, and how much they need to hear this and how valuable this message is for them to hear, the majority of that fear goes away. Because I'm not focusing on me anymore. I'm focusing on you and what you need. That is a very different headspace to be in, right? And I think I've kind of touched on this before, where like, if you really struggle with confrontation, right? And you're at a restaurant and they get your order wrong, they give you the wrong food, you may be less prone to correcting it. But if they get your friend's order wrong or your kid's order wrong, especially if they have like an allergy or some other intolerance, then you kick into, you know, protective mode of like, hey, this isn't what they got. Like, hey, whatever, right? We protect others before we protect ourselves a lot of times, especially if you struggle with confrontation. So if that is an issue and you're giving this big presentation and you're afraid of it, even before you step on stage, thinking about why is this important for these people helps you get out of your own way. And then a lot of that fear, especially what you said, Justin, like relabeling it as I'm excited, that's why I'm sweaty and have to pee. Cool. If you combine those, if this is important for these people and I'm excited to deliver it to them, a large percentage of that fear melts away.
I think there's also just again, that willing to risk question always comes up to me, which is, sure, you might bumble and make a mistake and a few people might laugh at you if you do public speaking. Are you willing to risk that to say what you have to say? Are you willing to risk that, like you said, Corey, for the sake of delivering a message that you feel is important to you? So helpful. And Corey, there was something else on the first point you made. I'm trying to remember what it was that came up.
The controversial parts about anxiety and being a luxury and Action being
Oh,
the
I
antidote
got
to
it. Thank you. Yes. Yeah. The mistake that we make, I see myself and people make a lot with fear, is they do what, Corey, you're pointing to, which is called cognitively, emotively looping. They feel fear. They believe, they have some story about what's going to go wrong. Oh, everybody's going to laugh at me if I go out here and I screw up. And then they use that to feel the fear more intensely, which makes them believe the belief even more. And then you're just stuck. You're totally stuck. And a lot of what we pointed to here in the first step is if you want to work with your fear, you have to build a capacity to interrupt the loop. Whether it's through a body mobilization or going for what you're believing and challenging those beliefs and being willing to re-architect them, the big thing is you have to build a capacity to combat and interrupt cognitive, emotive fear loops. Okay, friends. Anything else on fear that you want to convey to our listeners and our viewers before we leave?
Fear is not bullshit, but letting it stop you is.
Fear means you're human.
Yeah, fear is a trusted advisor. And with
Very different perspectives. Emblematic of our personalities.
Checks out.
Yeah.
All that checks out.
And with that, consider following, subscribing, rating, recommending, and
Toodles.